Picture a Neanderthal sitting at the entrance of a cave somewhere in what is now southern France, watching the sun go down. Not because the view is particularly inspiring, though it might be. Not because there's nothing else to do, because there is always something else to do when survival is the full-time occupation. They are watching the sun go down because they have learned, not from a textbook, not from a teacher with a whiteboard, but from years of watching and the accumulated transmitted knowledge of their community, that when the sun goes down in a particular position relative to that ridge on the horizon, certain things follow with reliable consistency. The temperature drops more quickly. The animals they hunt begin moving toward the lower valleys. The night will be long in a specific way, longer than the nights of the warmer season, and the warmth of the fire needs to be planned for accordingly. There is a connection between the position of the sun, the behavior of the animals, the temperature of the air, and the practical decisions that survival tomorrow requires. The connection is temporal. It is a form of time knowledge, not abstract, not philosophical, not encoded in any system of notation, but real, functional, and operating in the mind of someone who has been watching this system long enough to read it. Is this understanding time? The question seems simple until you push on it. And when you push on it, it opens into one of the most profound and least examined questions in the study of human cognition. What does it mean to understand time? How did that understanding develop across human evolutionary history? And at what point does awareness of temporal patterns become the kind of conscious time reckoning that we mean when we use phrases like knowing what time it is, or understanding the past and future? The answers, drawing on archaeology, cognitive science, anthropology, and the study of ancient artifacts, tell a story about human temporal cognition that is far more ancient and far more sophisticated than most people assume, and far more interesting than any simple yes or no answer could capture. The first distinction that needs to be drawn is between three different things that often get conflated under the single phrase understanding time. They are related but not identical, and they developed across human and pre-human evolution on different timescales with different cognitive prerequisites. The first is biological time awareness, the body's internal rhythms and the behavioral adaptations to temporal patterns in the environment that operate below the level of conscious representation. Every living organism has biological time awareness in some form: circadian rhythms in single-celled organisms, seasonal migration in birds, tidal behavior in intertidal creatures. None of these require conscious awareness of time, but all reflect the organism's embedding in temporal cycles and the evolutionary pressure to track and respond to them. The second is experienced time. The conscious awareness of temporal flow, of events as preceding or following other events, of the present moment as distinct from past and anticipated future. This form of temporal awareness requires a brain complex enough to maintain representations of the recent past and near future simultaneously with perception of the current moment. Research on animal cognition suggests that various non-human animals have some capacity for experienced time. They can remember recent events, anticipate near-future events based on experience, and show behavioral evidence of awareness that time has passed. But the depth and scope of experienced time appears to increase with cognitive complexity in ways that make the human version distinctively elaborate. The third is representational time. The ability to represent temporal relationships abstractly, to use symbols or marks to record durations and sequences, to develop cultural tools like calendars and measurement systems that make time a manipulable object of thought rather than just an ambient feature of experience. This form of temporal cognition appears to be uniquely human, at least in its full development, and its emergence is traceable in the archaeological record through the physical artifacts it produces. Understanding where ancient humans were on this spectrum, and when they developed the various components of temporal understanding, requires examining both the cognitive prerequisites and the physical evidence those prerequisites left behind. The cognitive prerequisites for representational time, for understanding time in the full human sense, include capabilities that researchers in evolutionary psychology have spent decades trying to date and characterize. Mental time travel, the ability to mentally project oneself into the past or future, to recall past experiences as episodes and to simulate future scenarios, is considered by many cognitive scientists to be the foundational capability underlying human temporal understanding. The term was introduced by psychologist Endel Tulving, who distinguished between semantic memory, knowledge of facts about the world, and episodic memory, memory of personally experienced events with spatial and temporal context. Episodic memory and mental time travel appear to be specifically human, or at least to exist in a much more elaborated form in humans than in other animals. The debate about whether non-human animals have episodic memory has been active in cognitive science for decades, with various studies of food-caching corvids and other animals providing suggestive evidence of something like episodic recall. But the full human capacity for mental time travel, for vividly reconstructing detailed past episodes, and for richly imagining future scenarios, appears to depend on the kind of prefrontal hippocampal neural architecture that is most elaborately developed in humans. When did this capacity fully develop in the human lineage? The honest answer is that we cannot directly observe the cognitive capabilities of ancient humans. What we can observe is the behavioral evidence those capabilities leave behind, the artifacts and structures that require mental time travel to produce. Planning for the future beyond the immediate, storing food for a season rather than just a meal, preparing tools in advance for anticipated uses, selecting materials from distant sources based on their future utility, requires the ability to mentally project into a future scenario and work backward to current preparations. The evidence for future-oriented planning in the archaeological record extends back to at least 300,000 years ago in the Middle Stone Age, with some candidates for earlier planning behavior associated with Homo erectus tool-making traditions that required anticipating the shape of a finished tool at the beginning of a multi-step manufacturing process. The capacity for at least limited mental time travel appears to be very old in the human lineage. The physical evidence for temporal tracking, for marking, recording, or monitoring temporal cycles, provides the most direct window into when ancient humans developed representational time understanding. The tally mark artifacts discussed in other archaeological contexts, notched bones and ochre pieces bearing deliberate repeated marks in patterns suggesting numerical recording, represent the earliest physical evidence of a behavior that could involve temporal tracking. Whether the earliest tally marks were tracking time or quantities of other things is ambiguous, because a tally mark is a tally mark regardless of what it is tallying. But the question of when tally marks began to be used for tracking temporal cycles is separately addressable. The Lobombo bone, approximately 43,000 to 44,000 years old and bearing 29 deliberate notches, has been interpreted by some researchers as a lunar phase tally, 29 notches corresponding to the approximately 29.5-day lunar cycle. This interpretation is plausible but not provable from the artifact alone. The Ishango bone, at approximately 20,000 years old, shows patterns of notch groupings that have been more persuasively connected to lunar tracking because of the multiplicative relationships between the groupings. What the tally mark artifacts, across their range from 43,000 to 10,000 years ago, collectively suggest is that Upper Paleolithic humans were doing something with repeated numerical marking that required sustained attention to cycle and sequence. Whether or not every specific artifact represents lunar tracking, the practice of making marks to count something across time reflects a cognitive engagement with temporal sequence. The idea that events happen in order, that the number of events since a reference point can be tracked, and that this tracking has useful application, that represents a meaningful form of temporal understanding. The ability to track a cycle across its duration, to know, from maintained records, or maintained memory, where within the cycle the current moment falls, is qualitatively different from simply responding to environmental cues in the present. It represents the projection of a temporal model onto the environment, the use of accumulated past observations to locate the present within an anticipated pattern and to derive predictions about the future. This is representational time in a meaningful sense. The cave art of the Upper Paleolithic, concentrated primarily in France and Spain, but found across a wider geographic range, provides evidence of temporal understanding in a different form that has received less attention than the tally mark artifacts, but is arguably just as significant. The art itself requires planning and execution across time in ways that reflect temporal competence. Preparing pigments, selecting surfaces, executing images that sometimes involved preliminary sketching or planning stages. The production of Paleolithic cave art was a temporally extended activity, requiring future orientation and the sequencing of steps within a broader project framework. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. The existence of multi-session art, works that appear to have been created or modified across multiple visits to the same location, implies the ability to maintain a conception of an ongoing project across time intervals, to return to the project with memory of its state and intention to continue, which is a form of future planning that requires sophisticated temporal representation. Some cave art researchers have argued that certain arrangements of animal images encode seasonal information, that the selection and arrangement of animals in certain scenes reflects knowledge of seasonal behavior patterns, and potentially marks seasonal time in ways that make the art partly calendrical. The aurochs depicted in the famous Lascaux Hall of the Bulls, for instance, appear to include animals shown with certain seasonal indicators, coat patterns, horn development stages that suggest representation of animals at particular times of year. Whether this represents deliberate seasonal marking or simply accurate observation of seasonal variation in animal appearance is debated, but either way it reflects sophisticated temporal knowledge of animal life cycles. The representation of animal behavior in cave art more broadly is relevant to temporal understanding because animal behavior is deeply temporal. Seasonal movements, mating seasons, birthing periods, migration patterns. A hunter-gatherer community whose subsistence depends on tracking these patterns must maintain detailed temporal models of animal behavior across the annual cycle. The accurate representation of these behaviors in art suggests the artists possessed this temporal knowledge and considered it worth communicating visually. The monumental architecture of Neolithic cultures, of which Stonehenge and the many structures discussed in the astronomy context are the most famous examples, represents the earliest physical embodiment of calendar systems in built form, and it tells us something important about how ancient humans not only understood time, but considered it important enough to organize enormous social and material resources around marking it. The winter solstice alignment at Newgrange, approximately 5,200 years old, required accurate measurement of the solar year and the precise determination of the solstice sunrise azimuth, the direction from which the sun rises at the shortest day of the year, at that latitude. Determining this azimuth with the precision required for the Newgrange roof box alignment required either instrumental measurement using tools of some kind, or the accumulation of observations over multiple years until the exact position was determined through repeated watching. Either way, it required a temporal project extending over years, with the intention of building something that would mark a specific temporal event accurately, maintained across the duration of the project. The Neolithic calendar monuments represent, therefore, evidence not just of astronomical knowledge but of institutional temporal knowledge maintained by communities across timeframes longer than individual memory, organized through cultural transmission and collective practice, and considered important enough to warrant the enormous investment of labor and material that these monuments required. The monuments are, in a sense, externalized temporal memory, mechanisms for encoding and transmitting calendar knowledge in architectural form so that it persists beyond individual lifetimes. This institutionalization of temporal knowledge is itself a form of temporal understanding that goes beyond individual cognition. The community that builds Stonehenge is not just demonstrating that some individuals understand the solar year. It is demonstrating that the community has organized its temporal knowledge into a shared, transmittable cultural resource, a calendar system that represents collective temporal intelligence operating above the individual level. The linguistic dimension of temporal understanding, the way language encodes time, and the relationship between linguistic temporal structure and temporal cognition adds another layer to the question of what ancient humans understood about time. All known human languages have ways of referring to past, present, and future, ways of locating events in temporal sequence and indicating their relationship to the moment of speaking. Some languages do this through grammatical tense, obligatory verb marking that specifies temporal location. Others do it through aspect, marking the completion or ongoing nature of events without necessarily specifying absolute temporal location. Still others do it primarily through temporal adverbs and contextual inference. But no human language entirely lacks temporal reference, which suggests that temporal cognition, at least in the sense of representing event sequences and their relationship to the present, is universal in human language, and presumably in the cognitive architecture that language reflects. The universality of temporal reference in language does not tell us when human language with temporal reference emerged. That question, when human language developed its current complexity, is one of the most contested in the study of human evolution. But the connection between language with temporal reference and the capacity for representational time is strong enough that the development of modern human language and the development of full temporal understanding are probably deeply intertwined. The capacity to narrate, to tell a story about events that happened in sequence, to communicate past experience, to describe anticipated future plans, is both a linguistic capability and a temporal capability. Narrative requires the mental time travel capability that allows the speaker to re-access past events and represent them sequentially. And it allows the temporal knowledge of the narrator to be transmitted to listeners who did not directly experience the events described. This narrative transmission of temporal knowledge, of seasonal patterns, of historical events, of anticipated future conditions, is the mechanism through which cultural temporal knowledge accumulates and persists across generations in pre-literate societies. The ethnographic evidence from historically recent hunter-gatherer societies provides invaluable insight into what ancient temporal understanding probably looked like in practice, because these societies maintained forms of temporal knowledge and temporal practice that pre-agricultural societies presumably shared. Traditional hunter-gatherer calendars, systems for tracking the annual cycle and locating the present moment within it, are documented across virtually every traditional culture studied by ethnographers. These calendars are not all of the same type. Some are primarily lunar, tracking the monthly lunar cycle and counting months to locate the annual position. Some are primarily stellar, tracking the heliacal risings and settings of particular stars as seasonal markers. Some are primarily ecological, tracking the seasonal behavior of particular plant and animal species as calendar indicators. Many combine multiple tracking systems in an integrated calendar that uses redundant temporal markers to maintain accuracy. The sophistication of these traditional calendars is often surprising to observers accustomed to thinking of calendar systems as a product of literate civilization. The Aboriginal Australian calendar traditions, which divide the year into seasons defined by ecological indicators. The flowering of particular plants, the movement of particular animals, the behavior of the weather, are integrated with detailed astronomical knowledge in ways that produce accurate annual tracking without any written record keeping. The seasonal knowledge is maintained in oral tradition, in ceremonial practice, and in the ecological observation that community members perform continuously as part of their engagement with the living landscape. The precision of traditional ecological calendar knowledge is matched by its temporal depth. Aboriginal oral traditions maintain accurate knowledge of seasonal patterns across timeframes that extend far beyond individual living memory, preserving information about ecological cycles that modern scientific study has validated, information that can only be maintained through systematic temporal tracking across many generations of observation and transmission. The question of whether ancient humans had a concept of deep time, of temporal scales extending far beyond the human lifespan and human social memory, is one of the more philosophically interesting aspects of ancient temporal cognition. Modern scientific deep time, the understanding that the Earth is billions of years old and that human existence occupies an almost vanishingly small fraction of cosmic history, required the development of radiometric dating and other quantitative tools that are genuinely recent. Ancient humans did not have access to these tools and could not have arrived at the specific quantitative deep time framework that modern geology and cosmology provide. But various ancient cosmological frameworks developed conceptions of vast temporal scales that represent attempts to think about time beyond the human horizon, even without the quantitative tools to measure it precisely. Hindu cosmological time cycles, the Kalpa, representing approximately 4.3 billion years, and the nested cycles within it, represent a conception of cosmic time at scales that happen to be roughly comparable to scientific estimates of the universe's age. Not because ancient Hindu scholars had access to radiometric dating, but because the imagination, freed from the constraint of having to measure what it imagines, can reach for temporal scales as large as it wishes. Ancient Egyptian concepts of eternity, specifically the distinction between nehe, cyclic, recurrent eternity, and jet, static, unchanging eternity, represent a sophisticated philosophical engagement with the nature of time beyond ordinary human experience that goes beyond simply recognizing that time has been happening for a long time. The Egyptian framework engaged with qualitatively different forms of temporal existence, cyclical versus linear, bounded versus unbounded, in ways that required philosophical sophistication about the nature of time itself. The full picture of ancient human temporal understanding, assembled from tally artifacts, monumental architecture, traditional calendar systems, and the cognitive prerequisites that all of these imply, is not one of primitive or limited temporal awareness gradually approaching the sophisticated time understanding of modern civilization. It is a picture of sophisticated temporal cognition, different from modern scientific timekeeping in form, but not obviously inferior in the depth of engagement with temporal reality it reflects. That was already fully present in the Upper Paleolithic, and arguably was developing much earlier in the human lineage. The Neanderthal, watching the sunset from the cave entrance, was not simply responding to environmental cues with biological automaticity. They were, in all probability, located within an annual temporal model maintained in community memory, using the sunset position as a calibration point within that model, and drawing on that model to make decisions about tomorrow and next week and the coming season. They understood time in the functional sense that survival at the edge of the Ice Age required understanding it, not abstractly, not philosophically, but with the practical precision that knowing when to move, when to stay, when to plant, later humans, and when to prepare, demanded. The abstraction and philosophizing came later. The calendars and clocks and atomic precision came much later. But the fundamental human relationship with time, the awareness of being embedded in cycles, the tracking of sequence and duration, the projection of past patterns into future predictions, the transmission of temporal knowledge across generations appears to be extraordinarily ancient. Possibly as ancient as the cognitive architecture that makes us recognizably human. The Neanderthal was not reading a clock, but they knew what time it was, and in the environment they inhabited, that knowledge was worth exactly as much as any knowledge they possessed.